Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am Jay Kamlet. I am the co-founder of LawBank and am the managing partner of the independent law firm of Kamlet LLP, a commercial real estate lawyer here in Denver. Today, we're joined by an amazing group of panelists. First, the inimitable Sara Scott, the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Legal Inclusiveness here in Denver. Augusta Massey, the managing partner of Massey and Associates law firm in Las Vegas. She is also the president of the Las Vegas chapter of the National Bar Association and judge pro tem. Y.E. Scott, the senior assistant attorney general for the Colorado Attorney General's office. And Tyrone Glover, a civil rights and criminal defense partner with the law firm of Kilmer, Lane, and Newman here in Denver. I'm going to let them give you more of a background when we start the questions, but we have such an amazing and thoughtful presentation today that I really don't want to burden everyone with a lot of background at this point. I want to jump right into the questions related to what we're talking about today are really the moments that sparked change in 2020. A series of high-profile incidents of police violence against Black Americans in 2020, including the killings of George Floyd and Elijah McClain and the shooting of Breonna Taylor, have sparked nationwide protests, renewed calls for the removal of Confederate symbols, and produced public condemnations of systemic racism from lawmakers, corporations, sports leagues, and others. Yet many Americans are skeptical that this moment of racial reckoning will significantly change the United States. So I'm going to start with Sara Scott and ask her the first question: how did these particular cases affect you personally?
Well, thanks so much, Jay. And as Jay mentioned, I am the CEO for the Center for Legal Inclusiveness. And what we do is we support law firms and legal organizations and their diversity, inclusivity, and equity efforts. We do this in a number of ways. I won't get into all of that right now. I'll just jump right in. So Jay, personally, as a Black woman, this was of course devastating, but I have to say it was not at all surprising. In this community, we've known that things like this have been going on for many, 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 many years and many decades. I think the only difference here is that it was caught on camera and no one could exert any type of privilege in terms of changing the channel and not seeing what was going on for that 8 minutes and 46 seconds when George Floyd was murdered. I am optimistic, like other people, with respect to how this might impact and change systemic racism. I actually say that there's two pandemics going on in the world today, the COVID-19 pandemic and the one of racial reckoning. But I would be remiss not to mention the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years that it took to get here, years and tears and grief that so many Black, Indigenous people of color went through to get to this point. And so while there is excitement here, I think we have to definitely recognize the high price that this came as. So I also just want to mention something that is a little bit kind of out there. There's an idea about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma where people are actually impacted indirectly by the work that they do on the front lines. And now from what we're seeing today, everyone is experiencing vicarious and secondary trauma. You can't turn on the TV and not hear about COVID-19 numbers or not hear about more police brutality and not hear about all of the very difficult and heartbreaking things that are going on in our country. We just saw that last week. And so as you're sort of thinking about these issues, remember how, and especially as law firm leaders and legal organization leaders and leaders in general, remember that people are really being impacted.
And you gotta go with me.
All right, we're having some technical difficulties. Sara, you were muted, sorry, on the last couple sentences. Can you unmute? There you
I'm
go.
sorry.
No, it wasn't
So
your fault. We wanted to mute everybody else, but got you instead.
that's probably good.
No, not at all.
So do you recall when I was muted what I was talking about? I was just talking about remembering. Jay, are you paying attention to me over there?
I am listening. I'm hanging on your every word. So that's why
I just wanted us all to remember that we are all going through a certain type of vicarious and secondary trauma.
Yeah.
And that is something that we all need to be thinking about as leaders, as it relates to our team members, as it relates to the partners that we work with, that the whole country is, shifting and really being hurt and burdened by all that is going on. So again, as a Black woman, and I'm not saying I was more devastated than anybody else. I was devastated by everything that happened in 2020, but again, I was not surprised.
Thank you. Augusta, may we turn to you to the next question. Why were the events in 2020 different from previous events that dealt with police violence against Black Americans?
Thank you so much for that question, Jay. First, I just want to say thank you to LawBank and to all the organizers. It is great to be here with you guys from Las Vegas. As was mentioned earlier, I wear several different hats, but I think today I just want to focus on the fact that I am the president of the Las Vegas chapter of the National Bar Association, which was formed in 1925, and it is the oldest and largest association of predominantly African-American lawyers, judges, and other paraprofessionals. And so to answer your question, I don't know if the events were so much different as opposed to the fact that the climate was different. Going back to what Sara had mentioned earlier, I think it was, it was captured. It was something that was horrific, the length of time we could watch. And it was happening in a time where the world had stopped, right? Like the world, for all intents and purposes, has been stopped by the pandemic. So our usual distractions, if you will, our usual everyday activities, things that, could or would have supplanted or suppressed that kind of information in a 24 hours news circle didn't happen. And so I think the stark imagery and the communication and the visuals actually force us as a globe really to confront the issues that we have in America. And you can see from protests all around the world, it wasn't just going on here, it was all over. You could see that the pandemic with the stay-at-home orders, we just really had to sit with it and couldn't easily move to something else. So I don't know if the events were different because we just had MLK, and that was something else I thought about this panel, that we're sandwiched right in between, MLK Day yesterday, and then tomorrow a historic, I would think, and hopefully a peaceful transfer and a shift in ideology that we have seen in the last 4 years. So this event today, I think it has a very powerful significance, and I'm so glad for everyone who could join us. And so the events that happened over the summer, over last year, just hit a little bit different and hit, I think, in a more personal space. Also, I think, like Sara was saying, this trauma that was going on, a lot of people were already traumatized by the pandemic, losing lives. And so this was just another layer on top of this pressure point, and I think it just lit the powder keg. There's a book that I'm going to refer to a lot. It's one I started reading. It's called Cast. No, of course you can't see it by stuff, but okay, hopefully you can see. Hide it. So it's called Cast by Isabel Wilkinson. And what I love about her is this profound affection she has for the subject and how she really draws upon the missing piece, the different pieces of the puzzle that have really brought us to where we are today. It's a great book. It's one I'm still reading. It's riveting. I think it really explains a lot of why this hit different than before.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Augusta. YE, I'm going to turn to you. How optimistic are you that we will see noticeable changes in 2021 that will improve Black, Indigenous people of color's lives?
I'm very optimistic. I know there are people who think that we've been through this before and haven't seen changes, but in this case, I find that, well, first of all, let me explain. I have represented almost most of the agencies in the state of Colorado. That was my job when I was the Senior Assistant Attorney General, representing different state agencies. Most of the time, I was the only minority at the board meetings, and they were surprised to find that I was their legal counsel. I am no longer with the Attorney General's office. I am retired, and happily so. But I am still involved in the same types of activities as I was when I was working. I am a lifetime member of the Sam Carey Bar Association, which is celebrating its 50th year this year. At the time that it began, there were 7 members. We now have over 400 African-American attorneys in Colorado and members of Sam Carey. So that's progress. I think we're still going to see progress because all of a sudden, although we've been saying for years that the police have been brutalizing and murdering African-American males and mistreating even the females, I find that now that they've seen it on TV with their own eyes and it has come to their attentions, the majority and the lawmakers are interested in making a change. And now that they are aware of it, that it's not an isolated incident, I think very much so that we're going to see some change, especially in the way police address particular issues. The incidents last week at the Capitol shows the difference of how they prepare for when there's protests by what they consider to be the majority and when there's protests by BLM. I mean, it was obvious. And with those types of obvious distinctions, people are saying, that's not right. And so, yes, I think there will be change.
Fantastic. So last but not least on this round of questions, Tyrone, how critical is a Black, Indigenous, person of color's perspective in the legal profession and in business overall? You're on mute, Tyrone.
Sorry. Thanks so much for the question, Jay, and thanks to LawBank for hosting this. I'm Tyrone Glover. I'm an attorney here in Denver. I'm a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer at the law firm of Kilmer, Lane and Newman. I was a public defender, a proud public defender in the Denver trial office, and so was really, up close and in the trenches with, everything criminal justice in Colorado. And now I'm at the civil rights firm, and we represent a number of individuals on police misconduct cases, discrimination cases. We were very much on the front lines of drafting the police accountability bill, and we represent, Elijah McClain and Devon Bailey, some of the more known cases, unfortunate cases out of Colorado. I think that the BIPOC perspective in the legal community and profession is especially important. I think, if you look across all of our different institutions, the difference between an institution being inclusive and diverse and you're not continuing to perpetuate a white supremacist or racist system is oftentimes the way that the laws are set up and structured, right? Those are like the institutional barriers or the institutional framework and mechanisms that oftentimes when you look at them, potentially on their face, they seem to not be racist, but they result in a racist result, right? When you put everything through the systems and through these machines. And we as lawyers are architects of these machines. We're, the social engineers. And, what I've seen, I would say probably over the last decade are, rooms full of very well-meaning people trying to tackle issues of social justice, cultural competency, diversity. And when they do it without having the perspective of Black and brown and Indigenous folks in the room, I've seen it time and time again fail, right? You can be well-meaning, you can read all the books and do all the research in the room, but you have to have those diverse perspectives and stakeholders at the table to really, I think, come away with a good result. And just having been in a number of those meetings and sort of, seeing those points, right, the forks in the road to where, it would go one way But then when a diverse perspective, speaks up and sort of adds some context, it, sort of will steer in the other way. And you're like, wow, if that person hadn't been in the room to offer that perspective, this organization or this company would have ended up in a very different place. And I just think, post summer of 2020, there's an expectation that our organizations, our institutions are competent in these issues, that they're diverse, that they're working in a way that is meaningful in social justice arenas and issues. And if you don't have, Black and brown folks at the table when they're trying to make these decisions, I think they're just going to fall flat. And the days of that being tolerated by just the greater public, I think are behind us. And so to your question about why it's important in business, I just think businesses are not going to be able to compete because they're going to be held to a higher standard. And when they can't do it, they're going to fall flat.
I think also in that vein related to business, because business often drives, particularly in law, business what the in-house counsels want in those companies, big companies. If they're looking at outside counsel, they're demanding diversity. We could talk a little more about that, but I'm also optimistic that the corporations out there are not just putting a check mark on it, but demanding that their providers or legal providers conform to these ideals. Does anybody else want to talk about any of those 4 questions before I go on to the next issue?
Jay, this is Mark Spitz. Could I just build on what you were just saying about general counsel and in-house attorneys?
Sure.
I was in-house for about 15 years, and in the early 2000s, the Association for Corporate Counsel was really starting to get into the, what it called at the time, diversity initiatives, asking their outside counsel to, talk about diversity and walk the walk, if you will. So that's been going on for a long time. What kind of progress have those outside law firms, especially, larger and large firms, made? I don't know that they've made much progress over the last 15 years in responding in any meaningful way to those requests. And I don't know what that reflects. Perhaps our panelists can weigh in on, not just to confirm my assumption there, but also what is that telling us?
Mark, if I could, that's actually it's a great segue to the next set of questions.
I'm doing your work for you, Joe.
That's okay. I love it. That just means that we were asking the right questions. So again, if there's any of the panelists want to respond to any of the previous questions that were asked before I move on to that important topic.
Hi, this is Augusta. I guess I just wanted to piggyback on one of the questions regarding whether the change is noticeable. I think I want to piggyback off Y.E. Scott's question. And just to say that change takes time. So I don't know how much change that we're going to see or how noticeable it's going to be, but it's something that I feel takes time. But we're now in a place where I feel like we're more galvanized. I think a lot of people have now been baptized into the fight, into the struggle, if you want to say. And I think that we might then find an ally maybe in government over the next administration. So, and then also just to point out that change also depends on like your geography too, I would say. So like what's happening in Vegas might be different from what's happening in Denver, might be different from like California just passed the Crown Act. So just trying to figure out where you are in your geography and your space and figuring how you can help to support the changes that you want to see, I think will be critical as we go forward. Thanks.
And Jay, I'd like to weigh in on the change question as well. There's been a few moments when, you sort of have this feeling like there's a groundswell of change, and whether it's played out rightly or wrongly, has depended on a number of factors. I am optimistic that there's going to be some real change here, because people really, I think, have been inspired to go to work and to go to work in a meaningful way and push things forward. Like there's been, I remember when, President Obama was elected, there was this great sort of like, oh, this is amazing. We're going to have change now. We're going to have hope. But the actual sort of tangible action items of what was going to happen weren't there, right? And when President Trump was elected, and there was this huge sort of galvanization and resistance, and sort of the platform was where people were going to resist President Trump, but it was like what was the actual change going to be? What I'm seeing here coming out of this 2020 summer is, a lot of actual stuff that's being put on the board and put on the table. Like I looked at the legislative agenda for Colorado, and there is just a plethora of really good bills that are going to be coming down the pipe that are seeking to make some really meaningful change in the same vein of what we saw over the summer. So as opposed to sort of this like just kind of broader 20,000 foot view of what change is could look like, what I'm seeing is, similar to what we saw with, HB 217, like real tangible stuff that galvanized and motivated people are doing and working hard to push through. And so, it makes me optimistic that some of this more theoretical stuff is turned into some cognizable action items.
Tyrone, could you tell people, for benefit of our Nevada members, what HB 217 provided?
So it was the Police Accountability and Integrity Bill, and I may have reversed those two, but when you sue an officer, so like the officer who was murdered George Floyd, right, or the officers that murdered Elijah McClain, you do it under Section 1983 in federal court, and the officers have often what's called qualified immunity, meaning they cannot be held personally responsible for their actions, even if they murder somebody. And so what Proposition 217 did is it did away with qualified immunity at the state level. And so now if you bring what would sort of be like a 1983 claim, constitutional claim in Colorado state courts, now the officers can be held personally responsible for their actions on the job. So this was oftentimes just a shield that they would use. And if the police departments didn't reprimand them, then they got off essentially scot-free. So this was really a game changer. We were the first state to do this. And I'm seeing now with the legislative agenda and things that are getting teed up for this next cycle, that the momentum from this summer around 217 is carrying over into even more stuff. I think there's going to be another bill refining some of the points in 217. But yeah, that's sort of the high level.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, anything else before I go on to the next important topic?
Can I just say something, Jay?
Sure.
So my name's Karen Steinhauser, and I am a law professor and judge, and I also do implicit bias trainings. And I think as we talk about the issue of diversity, that we have to keep in mind, I think, two very different definitions. And along with diversity is the issue of inclusivity. And what we see still at the law school level, what we see in different firms, the push towards making organizations more diverse and bringing in more students of color and all of these great things, and even the law firms that sign on to the Pledge to Diversity. But that is not enough. And until organizations understand that it is not just about the numbers, it is not just about being able to say I'm part of the Pledge to Diversity, but making sure the organizations are inclusive. We're seeing too many students of color that end up leaving after the first year, after the first semester. We're seeing too many lawyers who are brought into firms who end up leaving. We're seeing environments where even though they are part of law firms, the Pledge to Diversity, there's still issues in terms of the microaggressions and things that get said and comments that are allowed to be a part of the organization. So until we also address that aspect, we're not going to get where we want to be.
Great, another great segue to this next category. So let's
let
jump
me
into
say
that.
something in response to what Karen just said, if that's all right, Jay.
Certainly, why?
I think she's absolutely right that we need to see this, but the only way you're going to see it happening in the firms, and I'm sure Sara will will back me up on this because I was on the board at CLI, is that it has to come from the top down. You know, a lot of times you'll have maybe one partner that wants to include you, but unless you make it an actual policy at the firm and that the top people make sure it happens, it's not going to last.
Thank you. Thank you. So despite the increased emphasis on diversity and inclusion in law firms, the legal profession remains among the least diverse of any profession. According to the American Bar Association's National Lawyer Population Survey in 2007, just 4% of active attorneys identified as Black or African American. Subsequently, the numbers remain mostly flat at around 5%. This is despite decades of diversity efforts and studies that diversity is good for business. I was going to switch up the order, but this question seems perfectly tailored for Sara. How can diversity and inclusion programs spark change in law firms? And why you spoke to it a little bit, but if you could expand.
Sure. So I just want to just piggyback on what Wai said. If leadership is not on board, then any DEI efforts, they absolutely will fail. And they'll fail. It might not fail the first year. It might not be the second year, but they will fail long term. It has to be part of a strategic plan. It has to be something that is talked about at every meeting. It has to be something that leadership is absolutely on board with. It has to be something that leadership gets trained about. That's where CLI comes in. We train leaders a lot. So we make sure that they do know the difference between diversity, being invited to the party, and inclusivity, being asked to dance, and really working on what DEI means for their firms. And it really starts at law firms looking at what their core values are and re-examining what those core values are. So whatever their core values may have been before 2020, irrelevant today. They have to look at those core values and make sure that their mission statement and their goals and their action plan are aligned with those values. And DEI, you know, we all know that it increases the bottom line. We all know that there's more creative outcomes as it relates to clients. We all know that law firms themselves and legal organizations definitely benefit from having a more diverse group of attorneys. But the inclusivity piece, right? If leaders aren't actually learning about I call them team members, I don't call them staff. If they're not learning about their team members on an individualized level, you know, it's interesting. I'm reading B 2.0 by Tom Collins. I almost said, no, Jim Collins. I almost said Tom Collins. By Jim Collins, who speaks about how it is an absolute imperative. It is one thing that leaders must do, and the 7 things that he talks about is to have a personal touch, is to have a personal connection with their staff members, is to do things like walk the halls and figure out what's going on the ground level, is to look at people holistically and not just as their rank, not just as a junior associate. And it is to, if there's a junior associate who, you know, usually a lot of times managing partners categorize people and they do so quickly. And so that first memo that comes out, you know, one junior associate might write it one way and another junior associate could write it another way. And instead of automatically saying that, you know, one of the memos was worse than the other, let's get that person a writing coach. Let's focus on equity here. Let's think about what we can do to make that junior associate, you know, a high potential team member instead of, you know, leaving them behind, right? There's so many things that law firms can do to strengthen their inclusivity. One of the things that I really talk about is that everybody at a law firm should be taking a strength finders test and sharing their results with other people so they know how to work with other people and what their own strengths are and what they will bring to law firms. The change that can be sparked in law firms is the potential is so vast, But if we don't get leaders on board, and if the leaders don't understand the importance of this, and there's ways to make them understand besides just writing them off, right? There's ways for junior associates or less experienced team members to come together. There's many ways, to also educate your leaders. And again, one of the ways is to become members of CLI, because we train leaders separately from their team members to make them understand. But we're lawyers, right? I practiced for 15 years before stepping into this role. Lawyers need facts. Lawyers need to really understand how it impacts the bottom line. Lawyers need to understand that if they don't, again, step into this role, that they will eventually fail and that they're going to have retention issues. And general counsel is not going to hire them because they are not going to have the diverse workforce working on a case or working on a matter that general counsel wants. So I would say that would be my answer. I kind of hope that answered the question. I know I jumped around a little bit.
It's great. It's great. Wai, can I ask you then to follow up a little bit on what would you say? You served on the board of CLI. What do you say to executives who still don't buy into why diversity is essential for their firms?
It's not a matter of what you say to them. It's a matter of what you indicate to them they need to be doing. There is nothing wrong. I worked in government for 28 years, actually for 31 years. But at the AG's office, you can make a suggestion and say, hey, I was at this meeting and this is what happened. And this is what could have happened or should have happened. This is what I would have liked to see happen and why that makes an effect on my client. And if you do it that way, then you continually do it that way, then the leadership is going to understand we've got to get this together so it doesn't happen over and over again.
And when you were talking about the leaders, were you talking about the agency, each of the agencies you represented? Or were you talking about the general overall AG's office?
Well, I'm talking both.
Okay.
It was easier for me to do it from the inside because I was in the AG's office, but also at their agencies, they could find that way. I mean, I didn't have a problem speaking up and saying, I'm offended by that statement because, and it gives them a different perspective. And that perspective is what's needed in business and in law.
Great, great. To talk a little bit about to touch on what Karen mentioned, Augusta, why is the one-size-fits-all approach to diversity and inclusion disastrous? Why don't people see the distinction there?
Okay, that's a good question. The one-size-fits-all approach, I think, is disastrous for a number of reasons, and specifically, from a very strategic perspective. Copying and pasting what other companies are doing into your own organization creates problems, right? Because you're attempting to duplicate initiatives from another place that doesn't take into account your own law firm's culture, your own organization's culture. Also, you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach because diversity means different things to different people. Inclusion means different things to different people. What might work for, let's say, gender or correcting some systemic gender problems might not work for racial problems. And it also doesn't account the systems and the procedures and the culture of whatever place that you're trying to solve the issues. So a one-size-fits-all approach, I think, then leads to disaster, because then now you're treating your people and your employees as this homogeneous group, right? And that's very, very ineffective. Every person, like Sara mentioned, talking to your T people, is that what you call your T, or like your staff, is what we'll say. Yeah. Talking to them and really understanding, and everyone brings with them their own experiences and their own backgrounds, and all of that together makes up the culture of your firm. And so with your different experiences in the workplace, everyone faces like maybe a different DI disadvantage, and that disadvantage might show up in a different way. So instead of treating it as a one-size-fits-all and making assumptions and pandering to stereotypes, it is really important that for your firm, you understand the systemic problems in it, create goals and metrics to measure how you want to correct it, and then go to work making a long-term commitment to doing that. So I always tell this to my clients, and I'm notorious for saying this, things don't go wrong, they start wrong. So things don't usually go wrong. Like, oh, my study, oh my God, I don't know what's going on at law firm, blah, blah, blah. It started from the beginning. And I think that's also the problem that we're seeing on a larger perspective in our industry. From the beginning, a lot of the laws that we have were put in place to normalize systemic racism and oppression, and they were put in place to enforce these things. And so what we're experiencing today is a larger symptom of a broken foundation. And so for CEOs and thought leaders and people who are in a position to lead organizations, a one-size-fits approach hasn't worked. So it is time to go back to the drawing board, go back to your core mission, go back to your core values, reevaluate that, figure out where the problems are, create new solutions, and then make a lasting commitment to that. Every business that I have run or been involved with, every quarter we go through the numbers, right? At the end of the year, we go through the numbers. There are always KPIs, performance matrix that we're checking. And so I think that approach almost needs to be brought into our fields and our industries if we really want to see long-lasting progress.
I love that phrase. It didn't go wrong, it started wrong. I love that. I'm going to steal that.
I just wanted to add in to that perfect answer that Augusta just gave is, you know, different organizations are at different places in their DEI journey. And not only that, but different people within those organizations are at different places in their DEI journey. And so one of the things that CLI does when they go in to consult, I actually interview a whole host of people in an organization to understand the culture of the organization, to understand where people are individually, so that then I can make sure that the training program I'm creating is actually going to fit the organization's needs. And the other thing that I think that we really have to recognize that we haven't touched on is that organizations and leaders have to understand and realize that white privilege is a real thing. And that especially in law, the laws, you know, have been built on white privilege and white supremacy. And white privilege is not something that's individual, it's something that's institutional. So it's not, you know, putting a blame on somebody in particular, like you, Jay, as a white male, but it is saying that this is an institutional issue that we have to recognize. And before we can recognize that and swallow that, then we can't talk about implicit bias, then we can't talk about the difference between diversity and inclusivity, then we can't talk about microaggressions and microaffirmations, then we can't talk about what it means to be an ally and what it means to be anti-racist and what it means to be an accomplice. That's where the starting place is. And again, it's institutional, not individualized, because blame is not what we're trying to do here. But I think that to really realize and recognize that DEI is a social justice tool. If you go back and look at a lot of the speeches that Martin Luther King gave, you know, during his time, the answers to those are in diversity, equity, and inclusivity. That's what he really wanted to see. So DEI, again, is a social justice tool and a way to combat the racism that we have all reckoned with during 2020.
Could you expand a little bit on, you said you come in and individualize programs for firms and for, can you talk a little bit about that exercise, please?
Sure. So for example, one of our members is in Washington, D.C. and they have, or now I think they have one, but they had no Black attorneys. And so when I went through and was talking about people at every level, they had different things to say about what they thought, you know, diversity could bring to their organization, or, you know, what the difference between diversity and inclusivity was, how they felt about whether or not there could be actual change in their organization, you know, and I got very different answers from very different people. You know, one person thought that they were a very inclusive organization, while another person indicated that they weren't allowed to speak Spanish in the hallways with another team member, you know, that a partner told them that they weren't allowed to do that. So I had to grapple with, how do I create a training that addresses all of these issues, right? And doesn't call people out individually, because that's not what I'm trying to do here. But what I'm trying to do is support an organization and their DEI efforts and get them from A to B, you know, in a way that is individualized to them. Whereas you take, you know, a law firm such as Holland and Hart, and they have a chief diversity effort in Phyllis Wan, who is amazing and, you know, knows, she's an expert in DEI herself. So that's a very different type of organization that you would be going into and doing trainings about, but you would still want to have conversations with people to understand where they are on their journey, so that you can create language that everybody understands. Because if we don't start by speaking the same language, we can't have those difficult conversations that is going to lead to a strategic plan that is then going to lead to lasting DEI efforts.
Great, thank you. We have some members of the Nevada Bar Association, the leadership team of the Nevada Bar Association on the call. I'm sure they'd love to get your information, because they're starting a lot. They're starting in or promoting a lot of initiatives in the DEI.
Oh, how wonderful! We would love them to become members, and I would love to speak to them.
Great, great. So Tyrone, let me ask you then. You know, as somebody who's started their own firm, have worked at other firms, have been partners at a couple firms. You know, when you hire more diverse employees, which is essential, then you have to retain them, which is a critical component of that. What do you think? What changes can executives implement to hire more diverse staff and then make it a priority to keep those employees from leaving? Those team members. Sorry, Sara. Those team members.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just really comes down to making sure that you're offering meaningful opportunities to not only connect with the culture of the firm, but connect with the work and the work that they set out there to do, right? I feel like oftentimes what happens is, you know, as soon as someone gets there's a diverse hire or a diverse partner comes over, then they breathe a big sigh of relief and sort of go about their day, right? And they're not checking in with that individual. They're not, you know, taking inventory of the types of cases or matters that they're working on, and wanting to know whether they feel fulfilled or satisfied with the work, or, you know, whether the workload is manageable. You know, really making sure that, you know, you're including those individuals in firm activities. And it's not even so much the formal ones, right? Like the holiday parties or the, you know, firm outings, right? That are on the books. It's oftentimes the very informal stuff, right? Like the lunches, or the sort of informal happy hour that sort of materializes, you know, pretty consistently, but, you know, every Friday or so, right? Like making sure that you're including people not only in the, you know, the work of the firm, but the culture. And I don't know, it's one of those things that I think you don't necessarily have to overthink it, right? And I think some of this like one size fits all stuff is tempting, because you don't have to get uncomfortable, right? You can sort of come up with this plan and you know, lay it out, and it looks all pretty on a piece of paper, and then, you know, check in every once in a while and determine whether you're implementing it. When in actuality, just good old fashioned, you know, bridge building, relationship building, meaningful work partnerships, bringing them in on like the big cases, giving them meaningful things to do, and just really including them the way that you would any other associate or partner goes a long way. And so that's, you know, I'm president this year of the Denver Bar Association, and that's what we're stressing really is building, you know, authentic, organic bridges with our partners and working together on things that are meaningful to both sides. And in doing that, I think, you know, ultimately the relationships that you build are longer lasting and stronger. And to the extent that someone is getting burnt out or sees themselves leaving, because oftentimes when, you know, a diverse lawyer leaves, it's too late at that point to retain them. If you can sort of hear that inclination earlier in the process that they're starting to be dissatisfied, then I think you have a opportunity to remedy it before it's too late.
Great, great.
Jay, can I just say
yeah.
a 15-second thing to that?
Yeah.
Think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What's third on that list is a sense of belonging. And so just to Tyrone's point, third on Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a sense of belonging. So it is just absolutely crucial that you do that by any means necessary.
Thank you, Sara. How did you find and create opportunities to make your agencies that you represented, as well as the AG's office generally, more diverse?
That's a tough question, Jay. I think you have to, first of all, be assertive enough to speak up and say that this is different, or should be different, or could be different. I think one of the books, based on what Augusta was saying, is that it's wrong from the beginning. There's a book called Stamped from the Beginning. It's the history of racism, where the majority, which was white at that time, set the norms. And it's hard to change a norm. So when you go into an agency that has that kind of culture, you have to agree to be open to changing the norms.
That's great. That's great. I've often got asked questions about, okay, so you're in a position of white privilege. You're a leader of a law firm. You're a leader in a community. How do you become an ally? How do you show that you're an ally? And what I tell people is that most people of any race, religion, don't believe themselves, I don't think, to be racist, at least inherently. Some may want to just say, absolutely. Some of those people at the Capitol debacle on the 6th, more than happy to reflect their views of anti-Semitism and racism. But for the most part, especially people in professional businesses, I think it's just important also to reach out to reach out to the members like myself, where you say, I'm looking for help. I want an ally. I want, and somebody like me who sees himself rightly or wrongly as colorblind and gender neutral and all the right buzzwords, would be more than happy to assist and to grow. And I think it's so important to just lay it out there, the question, how can you help me? If you want me to stay in this firm, if you want me to come to this firm, how are you going to help me? That would be a powerful question to somebody like me who would love to, nothing else but to support that candidate. So
let me just say something, if I may, Jay.
Sure.
And not to call anyone out, but sometimes it's hard for people to speak up because of that power inequality, right? I remember as a first year, I didn't feel empowered enough to be. And then I graduated in the middle of a recession. I didn't feel empowered enough to go to like your office and be like, hey, Jay, I need you to be an ally at the next partnership meeting. Like, what you're talking about? We're in the middle of a recession. We're trying to cut people here. And so sometimes just recognizing that there might be a power inequality, so to speak, which might dissuade people from speaking up. I think the better thing is to always approach it from the perspective that we are all human, regardless of race, age, whatever it is, and we're all working in an organization towards a common goal for our clients. And so seeking to actually know people and engaging in those uncomfortable conversations and knowing that failure is part of that process. You will mess up. You will say things that will come across as insensitive. You will say things that will be considered microaggressions. It is part of your retraining. You think about when you rode a bicycle, or when you learned a new language, or when you became a lawyer. You are always in the process of learning. Failure is part of that process. The ability, though, to recover from that, bounce back, add that to your inventory of learning, and then continue forging ahead, regardless, I think is really what makes all of us really a better society. So knowing that you will fail, engaging in those conversations, and then sharing what you learn with other people who maybe I may not be able to have that conversation because I don't play golf. I don't know. I may not be able to have that conversation because whatever the reasons are, you might be in that room where I'm not in. And so your not a responsibility, but your ability to share too with others as you learn, each one teach one. I think it also then spreads the knowledge base. And then finally, knowing when to hire a consultant and get expert help. Sometimes we're not equipped with the tools to have these conversations. That's why even in our cases, we get experts. I know lawyers, we think we know it all. I know it all, but we often get experts in our cases. So sometimes it may be important to get a DEI expert, someone who is dedicated to this kind of work that can help you navigate and overcome those booby traps that you may not even know are there. I think getting that help when you need it, just like you would in a case, just like you would get an extra pair of eyes on a brief before you turn it into court, you're also aligning yourself with the people who have the tools to help you for your organization is also critical. And then pay them. Always support with money. Pay them for the work. Yes.
Great. So we
Jay,
have
I think I can say this because I know you really well.
Yeah.
You are not colorblind. There is no such thing as colorblindness. That whole generation of people who were raised, it was Generation X, my generation, using that word of colorblindness, created a situation where we didn't talk about race and where we didn't have the difficult conversations when your kids were young. So for people of color, they obviously had the conversations because you have to have the conversation. You have to have the police conversation. You have to have other conversations. But colorblindness is not what we're trying to do here. Colorblindness is we're trying to look at diversity and inclusivity and bring people who are different in. And I know that you're not colorblind and that's not what you meant. I also know that you didn't mean when people should come into your office and the power dynamic that Augusta talked about, it is not up to Black, Indigenous people of color to educate white people about their plight. It is just absolutely, that's not who it's up to. It's up to white people to educate themselves about the plight of Black, Indigenous people of color. And so to really, that's just such an important point that I just wanted to make.
It is a very important point, if I can piggyback on what you're saying, Sarah, but white people cannot necessarily educate themselves. They have to be able to bring the subject up and offer to learn from the Indigenous people. And that's where part of the problem is. They expect us to come forward and say, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know what to ask. And that applies to everyone. I mean, my neighbor is a Trumper. I mean, a true Trumper. And she couldn't figure out why people were still protesting when she said, George Floyd's been dead for months. Why are they still protesting? That's a person that doesn't know. I said, they're protesting not just for George Floyd, but for the people that died before George Floyd and the ones that are going to die after George Floyd if something doesn't change. I have 4 male grandsons. Okay, I have 3 sons. I'm protesting for them, so that they don't become George Floyd. But until you have that conversation, until white people actually talk to the people of color and find out what their life is like, they don't know what to ask. They can't imagine what our lives are like.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We have a few minutes left. If there are any questions, if you notice in the chat button, the chat box, Miranda has been putting some of the books that were mentioned here. So please feel free, if you haven't gotten those off the chat box, feel free to reach out to Miranda or myself, and we'll get you the links to those books. Anything else that the panelists want to provide in the meantime?
I'd like to just, I thought, one of the most powerful things about this summer, you know, and just sort of being out there and protesting last summer, was just seeing folks show up, right? They just showed up to the protest. They weren't necessarily asked, you know, but they were compelled to show up in the space because they knew there was this ongoing injustice, and they wanted to help amplify voices towards change. And I think that model applies really across the board. If you're a leader or a managing partner in a law firm and you know that there's this issue of attracting diverse talent and retaining it, and there are issues of inclusivity in our legal profession, you know, just sort of showing up in that space as an ally, an ally willing to learn and an ally willing to help, just goes a long way. And, you know, there may be some imperfections along the way. I'm sure there's plenty of people that showed up to the protest that learned, you know, how to do it more effectively over the course of the summer. But just stepping into the arena and being willing to learn, but, you know, saying, look, I want to be on the right side of this. I want to be on the right side of history. And, you know, I want to at least put forth the sweat and the effort to attract and retain, you know, really talented and value added people. So I think that's kind of like the big across the board, if you will, I don't think lesson that we can take away from a lot of this.
And I just wanted to add something real quick and I always try to leave with something so that this is just not another CLE, you know, another Zoom call where we all came together. But I always ask, like, what is the action our listeners, the audience, is going to take in the next 2 to 4 weeks to really advance DEI initiatives wherever you are? And what are you going to do for yourself personally? And so I know there were some articles shared with me by a friend. I think Miranda is going to share that with everyone. And so what you could do in the next 2 weeks could be as simple as reading one of the books that have been recommended, or reading one of the articles, or actually having that sit down, opening dialogue discussions with a coworker that you may have overlooked before. And I think especially now it's challenging when we're doing everything virtually and everyone is working from home. So you don't have that office setting, but at the same time, it may maybe even be better because now you can have a one-on-one that you may not have had before. It could be maybe developing a skill or finding ways you can improve your cultural competency. I think it will be important. And if you want to share, that's fine in the chat, but what maybe 2 things or 1 thing you can do in the next 2 to 4 weeks. Once you're doing that and building on it, you'll find some really tangible results in yourself and in your organization.
Can I just say something to that? And this deals with our white privilege. And in terms of something that every single one of us can do, and that is to stop being silent. And I just, you know, that is, you know, we talk the talk, you know, people show up to the protests, but until we stop being silent, you have to be willing to take risk. You have to be willing to take a risk that you might lose that friendship, or you might be perceived as a troublemaker or whatever it is. We have to be willing to take risks and not be silent, because silence is acceptance. And when you hear something, when you see something and you think that, well, somebody else will say something, or that person of color will raise it, or somebody else is going to do something about it, you are complicit. And those of us that have that privilege have a duty to stop being silent.
Excellent. Great note to end on. It is 1 o'clock. I want to respect everybody's time, and I want to thank our panelists from the bottom of my heart for participating today. It was an amazing, amazing presentation. I hope everybody does spend the next couple of weeks focusing on some actions that they would take to move in the right direction. So thank you to everybody. And anybody who, again, wants any information from today, our recording, or information on the books that were offered, please let us know.
I'll put it in the blog post, Jay. I'll put it on your website.
There we go. Thanks so much, everyone.